It's so exciting to be joined this morning by Dr. Harpreet Singh, who is the global leader in biomarker-driven clinical research and development at Precision for Medicine, and formerly a division director of oncology at the FDA. Who's going to be speaking to us today about the KRAS story, which, just for some context, the development of KRAS is quite an amazing story. It was a target that was previously thought to be undruggable, and we spent a lot of time working on this over the last several decades. And then now we have multiple FDA-approved KRAS targeted therapies, at least for KRAS G12C. Dr. Singh, you were at the FDA during this, and now you're part of this very interesting article about the lessons learned from the drug development aspect of that. Would love to hear about your experience with that and maybe a little bit about the article that we're going to talk about today.
Sure, yes. So thanks for the introduction. And yes, as you mentioned, in my previous role as division director of one of the oncology divisions of FDA, I oversaw the development of multiple KRAS drugs, and the first one that we approved was Amgen's Sotorasib in non-small cell lung cancer for patients with G12C mutations. And now, as Chief Medical Officer of Precision for Medicine, most of our clients are small to mid-sized biotechs who are playing in a similar space. So basically that targeted therapy space for patients who have certain mutations or biomarkers.
No, and so the KRAS story is very interesting, and that's going to touch on this article a little bit. So what are some of the larger lessons learned from the clinical trial development and the accelerated approval for the first KRAS inhibitor? And I think just to piggyback off that a little bit, how do you think the field in general of drug development is changing in terms of trials, given that, we used to have just chemotherapy where we do, these dose escalation trials, find the MTD, and then, go into larger trials, where now we have targeted therapies where that adage doesn't necessarily hold as true anymore. So would love to hear your opinions and thoughts on that.
Sure. So the Amgen Sotorasib story was instructional for me in so many ways, but I think there were two major areas that are impacting drug development now. The first is, that we are in an information age now, and I think drug development is no longer between the sponsor and the FDA. Drug development is much more complex in the sense that it involves so many more stakeholders now. And with the Sotorasib story, it really involved the patient community and the investigator community. So about a year ago, in October of 2023, I convened an Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee about this KRAS Amgen application for Sotorasib. And the main issue here was that this was a breakthrough drug. It's an oral drug, a targeted therapy drug for a patient population that's about 13% of all of lung cancer. And the initial data showed that if you took this oral therapy, that the response rate was about, between 30 and 40%. And that is what was the alternative for patients at that time who had already progressed on the standard frontline regimen. It was single agent docetaxel, which is a chemotherapy, which is IV, which causes hair loss, which causes some other side effects, and importantly, had a reported response rate of 10 to 15%. So if you stack that up against this oral drug with, yes, some toxicities, but a different toxicity profile, and obviously doubling of the response rate, if you look at how this drug was developed, you could see how we ran into some issues with the randomized trial. And so let me elaborate a little bit further on that. So the initial drug development schema was a trial called CodeBreak 100. So this was a single arm trial in which patients were all received this oral therapy, and we had this response rate. So because of the regulations at the FDA, which allow for what we call accelerated approval, some people call it conditional approval, but basically you can take early promising results based on single arm trials, like in this case, that have a robust impact on the endpoint, in this case, response rate, that show that in the absence of a randomized trial, we have high confidence that this data will in fact end up being better than what's available. And so that was the basis for the accelerated approval of Sotorasib, which was granted in May of 2021. The issues, and this was all very public information, as it should be. As investigators publicized it, the company publicized it, patients were very much aware. As this was happening, the Amgen appropriately had already initiated a randomized trial, a true randomized trial, which was required from a regulatory standpoint, not only in the US, but around the world, to actually demonstrate in a randomized controlled trial that this novel targeted therapy would in fact edge out the age-old docetaxel in a time to event endpoint, like progression-free survival or overall survival. However, what happened in that trial was what we at the FDA at that time, and now I still believe, was viewed as a perceived loss of equipoise. And what does that mean? That means that both patients and investigators perceived that the control arm, perhaps, that the trial itself perhaps lacked equipoise. And how that showed up was that what we saw was that there was about a 23 patients in the Sotorasib arm, and the docetaxel arm dropped out of the trial right after they were randomized. It was an open versus one patient in the Sotorasib arm. That's actually huge. That's a really big deal. That's something we call asymmetric dropout. And this leads basically, without getting into a complex statistical discussion, it led to the inability to really interpret the results of that trial, of CodeBreak 200, which was this randomized trial. Why were patients dropping out of the trial once they were randomized to docetaxel? Well, first of all, it was an open label trial. What does that mean? That means that patients knew their treatment assignment once they were randomized. Why was that? Well, there was no choice to make this an open label trial. Going back to your point about oral therapies versus IV, FDA would have never, and it's not ethical to give patients placebo IV. And so it had to be an open label trial. So essentially, when patients found out they were randomized to docetaxel, they said, you know what, no, thank you. I don't need to have all the additional monitoring from a clinical trial to be on what's standard of care. So I'll just do standard of care with my home oncologist, or I believe many of them probably went to go get on competing trials since the KRAS space was heating up at that time. So the novelty of these agents relative to chemotherapy has changed the ecosystem of how clinical trials are conducted.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, because that's such an interesting perspective. And I think, you know, it prompted kind of a question in my mind. How do you think that we're going to move forward over the next 10 years in this new space? Because, you know, in my mind, like to your point in the KRAS story, you know, you had this drug that was so promising. It was a targeted therapy for a population, so there was more rationale for it working in this population. But then when the appropriate randomized trial was set to be conducted, there was these issues because people would drop out, they would go on other therapies, or if there's an accelerated approval, they could go on standard of care, first in class, versus going on a trial and potentially getting enrolled on an inferior arm, and at least in the public's opinion. So how would you say trials will have to adapt in the future to be able to accommodate such a rapid progression of development, which is good for patients, but, you know, making it honestly a little more challenging to conduct trials?
Well, thanks. I mean, I think there's many things that probably need to be adjusted in how clinical trials are conducted. But I think one of the key things is just going back to the CodeBreak 200 story. I said perceived lack of equipoise because it was perceived. When the trial read out, actually, Sotorasib did not handily edge out docetaxel on the PFS endpoint or in survival. And so that showed me that, yes, this trial needed to be done. And not to say that the drug shouldn't be available, and it very much is still available, but that sometimes those early results don't necessarily translate into the robust impact on the time to event endpoint. As far as how trials should be conducted in the future and what I see in the next 5 to 10 years, to me, it's really about education of both the investigators, the patients. It is an altruistic activity to enroll on a clinical trial. And so understanding why, if you are randomized to the control arm, why it's important to try to stay with that control arm or stay on the trial. And I think it also goes back to trial design. Let's make sure that our trial designs keep the patient at the center. And how do you do that? You do things like offering crossover within the trial design. And that means that if you are randomized to the control arm, that if you should progress on that therapy, that you immediately, what we call crossover, or you immediately get access to the drug on the other arm, on the experimental arm. So that's something that I think is helpful. Randomization schemas. So, you know, like you could consider a 2-to-1 randomization, for example. Is there a higher chance if you enroll on this trial that you'll get the experimental therapy? And also just, I think from a regulatory standpoint around the world, basically reevaluating how much data is needed to make regulatory decisions and on what endpoint. So could any work be done around assuring ourselves and assuring regulatory bodies that early promising results will in fact result in benefit on the time to event endpoint?
No, yeah, it's thank you for that, because it's a good problem to have, but it's interesting. And I think, you know, again, to come back to your point, and I see this so much in my practice, it's also very important to not get like super hyped up before there's actual randomized data, because I mean there is potential for, you know, harm to patients when something may not actually be as promising as we hope it is. And I think that is something to keep in mind too. Maybe just to round out, you know, you recently left the FDA. Could you tell us just a little bit about your new role and you know, Precision for Medicine and what the company's mission and goal is?
Yes, of course. So my new role is Chief Medical Officer of Precision for Medicine, which is a global oncology-based CRO. Our headquarters are in Bethesda, Maryland. We have a global footprint around the Americas, Europe, and APAC. We're part of Precision Medicine Group, which also includes Precision AQ, and that's part of the, you know, commercialization, launching drugs, and basically thinking about access to novel therapies at the time that they're being developed. So we have a nice continuum. So between these two groups, I think we cover the basis quite well of drug development, from first in human all the way to post-market launching and, you know, claims data, et cetera. How some of this story of Sotorasib and really the dose, which is what this article is about, was the dosing conundrum is relevant now, is that most of our clients are small to mid-sized biotechs within the oncology space and certainly within the targeted therapy space. And one of the other development issues that Amgen had, that we had with this Sotorasib drug, was how the dose was determined. And essentially, because the drug showed such a profound effect so early on in their engagements with FDA, there was a path to basically accelerate the development and access for patients to this drug. But in doing so, there was some, and so in reviewing the data for the accelerated approval, it became apparent that perhaps a lower dose should have been studied based on the pharmacokinetic data, the pharmacodynamic data, and the target saturation data. And it suggested that perhaps some more robust work should have been done early on to confirm, in fact, that the 960 milligram dose, which was actually 8 pills, they were quite large pills for what it's worth, was the optimized dose. There's no correct, it's really optimized. And because we did not want to delay access to this really promising therapy for patients, we did grant that accelerated approval in May of 2021, and we issued a post-marketing requirement for additional dose work at a lower dose. That work was done and then reported out to the FDA. And what it showed was results that made it challenging to make a decision in retrospect. The efficacy data did in fact look somewhat similar. There wasn't this very clear winner, if you will, and the safety profile also looks somewhat similar. Ultimately, a decision was made to keep the higher dose, to keep the initially labeled dose. And some of the reasons for that were really predicated around trends that we were seeing, but it was all descriptive data. And so I think the lessons learned from that story is that it's really ideal to do your dose work up front within the development program, even if it's moving really quickly, and even if the results are really promising. We could have some issues on the back end with launch and rollout of the drug and adherence if there's a suggestion that a different dose could have yielded similar efficacy with perhaps a little less toxicity. So that's where you see FDA's Project Optimus coming in, where they're saying, and this program kind of predated the rollout of Optimus. And so I don't think, so I think taking all those lessons, what I do in my day-to-day when I'm dealing with talking to our clients is I'm saying, okay, we're early phases here. What are we going to do? How are we going to build in dose exploration in a meaningful way so that we do get an optimized dose for patients?
No, that's interesting, and I think that's another point just to highlight that we're in this whole new age of oncology now, and it's much different with target therapies, immunotherapeutic targets, and being in the early phase drug development space myself, I mean it's I think trying to design phase 1, phase 2 expansion cohort trials where you glean as much information as you possibly can to not delay things is so important.
Yeah, and I mean I just want to say about the oral therapies piece, there has been some pushback about Project Optimus because I can say as a former FDA division director and now as a CMO working with clients trying to implement this advice, it's not a perfect system. But the intent behind it is that unlike chemotherapy, which you would get once every 3 weeks or so, it's IV, you have the toxicities, it's kind of this off on, they're more profound, certainly they're cumulative. The idea behind these oral targeted therapies is that if they're effective, patients would be on these potentially for years, daily. And so the idea that a grade 2 toxicity daily can be more bothersome to a patient than interval higher grade toxicities is real. And that was really a huge part of the impetus behind Optimus, is that how can we again optimize these daily oral therapies that patients are getting? And I think it's really important, and in my work and in your work, we have to bring the patient voice into this and really understand how they're feeling about these agents that they're taking and what it's doing for bother or side effect profile.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, patient advocacy groups are thankfully changing that in a lot of ways, but for so long they didn't have a voice in this at all. And I mean, their voices, that's ultimately why we all do what we do is for the patients. So not hearing, and that's, I honestly think, you just made me think of something else. You kind of see the same thing with immune checkpoint inhibitors. Like, I mean, you give one, like potentially, give a PD-1 inhibitor one time and someone gets a chronic toxicity, in a neoadjuvant setting, that's not trivial to the patient. I mean, it's not at all. Like they could have chronic rheumatological conditions, in rare cases, more severe toxicities. I mean, we really have to think more about those things as well.
Yeah, I don't know if you caught the July 26th ODAC. I was here when that happened, but that was about exactly this contribution of phase of regimen. If you're giving immunotherapy, neoadjuvant and adjuvant, yes, it may be relatively safe, but for those few patients who experience toxicity that's chronic, it's that was it worth it question. And we as a scientific field have to prove that in fact, yes or no.
And and to be honest, it's I know we're almost out of time, but I have a patient right now who got neoadjuvant pembro for triple negative breast cancer, who developed a severe serositis that now just persists, and it's been going on for years. Her breast cancer thankfully hasn't recurred, but she has to have, you know, multiple parasiticides. And I mean, the benefit for adding the checkpoint inhibitor in that setting is, you know, I mean, it's there, but it's not profound. And like, you know, these toxicities do happen, you know, it's terrible. So it's,
Yeah, and I think you're bringing back a really key point about the Sotorasib story about investigator bias and patient bias is that, yes, you know, this is unfortunate, these kind of 1 to 2% of patients. And overall, though, when we're making individual treatment decisions with our patients, like to drop off of a study, you know, what does that mean for the trial as a whole and for the field as a whole? So I think as investigators, you're always trying to balance, you know, what that looks like. And when you see, you know, these rare toxicities occur, I think it really hits home. First of all, why the trials have to be done in a way that's meaningful, in a way that keeps the scientific integrity of the trial, but also keeping the patient in front of you in mind. It's a delicate balance, and I definitely appreciate how challenging that is.
yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you so much again. That was a wonderful conversation, and I hope everyone has a chance to read such an important article, and thank you again.
Thank you.